They chained, the Omega beneath the blood moon altar. Then the great wolf awakened. Marcus Ellison was not the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room. He was average height, average build, with a quiet face that gave nothing away. He dressed simply, spoke carefully, and laughed only when something was genuinely funny. He had been described, at various points in his life, as reserved, dependable, and easy to overlook. He had heard all three words so many times that he had stopped reacting to any of them. He was 34 years old, and he lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of a mid-sized city in the American South. One bedroom was his. The other held a desk, a broken treadmill he kept meaning to fix, and 3 cardboard boxes he had never fully unpacked since moving in 2 years ago. The apartment was clean, but not decorated. It looked like someone was always about to leave. He had grown up the youngest of 5 children in a household where noise belonged to the older ones, and silence belonged to him. His father, Gerald, was a tall man with a commanding voice and very little patience. He did not hit his children, but he did not need to. A look from Gerald Ellison was enough to stop a sentence mid-word. His mother, Diane, was gentle and warm in the quiet hours, early mornings before Gerald woke, or late evenings after he had gone to bed. But in the main hours of the day, she disappeared into the background of her own home, and Marcus learned to do the same. By the time Marcus was 12, the family had a shape that no one ever named out loud, but everyone understood. His eldest brother, Darnell, was the success. His sister Patrice was the beauty. His brother Kevin was the funny one, the charming one, the one who got away with everything. His sister Lena was the religious one, the obedient one, the one who made Gerald proud. And Marcus was the youngest, which meant he was the last, which meant, in the unspoken language of that household, that he was the one who waited, the one who adjusted, the one who made room. He did not know as a child that this was unusual. He thought every family had a child like him, the one who absorbed whatever was left over, who ate last, who spoke last, who was loved last, not unloved, just last. He carried that position into adulthood the way people carry habits they formed before they knew better, without thinking, without questioning, as naturally as breathing. He took a job at a distribution warehouse at 22, telling himself it was temporary. 12 years later, he was still there, working the same floor, operating the same equipment, watching younger men get promoted around him, because he never raised his hand. Not because he was incapable, he knew the job better than almost anyone. He just never thought it was his place to say so. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Keisha for 4 years. She was sharp, driven, and full of opinions, and he had loved all of that about her at the beginning. She made decisions quickly and confidently, and he found it easy to follow her lead. What he did not notice, not for a long time, was that he had stopped having a lead of his own. He agreed with her choices. He adjusted his schedule around hers. He gave up his Tuesday evenings at the gym because she preferred they spend that time together, and then he gave up the gym entirely. And then he stopped mentioning it because he did not want to seem like he was keeping score. He was not keeping score. He was just disappearing, one small surrender at a time. His friends noticed before he did. His closest friend, a man named Troy, said to him once, sitting on Marcus's couch watching a basketball game, "You seem tired, man. Like, a different kind of tired." Marcus had nodded and said work was busy. Troy had looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the television, and neither of them said anything more about it. That was 2019. By 2021, Marcus had stopped going to the gym, stopped working on the short stories he used to write in a spiral notebook, stopped applying for any position above his current one, and stopped talking about anything he wanted, not because he was depressed in any dramatic way, not because something terrible had happened, just because the habit of making himself smaller had become so practiced that he no longer felt the edges of it. Then, in the spring of 2021, he sat in a doctor's office and heard a calm, practical man tell him that his blood pressure was significantly elevated for someone his age, that the readings were consistent with chronic stress, and that if he did not make changes, he was looking at serious health consequences within the next several years. Marcus thanked the doctor. He walked to his car. He sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes without turning on the radio or picking up his phone. He just sat there, watching other people come and go through the glass doors of the building, and he felt something stir in him that he had not felt in a long time. Not panic. Not sadness. Something older and quieter than either of those. Something that felt almost like a question. He could not name it yet, but it was there. In early 2022, 3 things happened in close succession, and together they broke something open in him that could not be closed again. The first was Keisha. She ended the relationship on a Thursday evening in February, sitting at his kitchen table with her hands folded and her voice steady. She told him she cared about him. She told him she had thought about this for a long time. She told him that she could not keep being in a relationship where she felt like she was the only one present, where she made every decision and carried every direction, because he had simply stopped showing up as himself. She said it without cruelty. She said it the way a person says something that is painful, precisely because it is true. Marcus did not argue. He did not ask her to stay. He sat very still and listened, and when she was done, he said, "I understand." She left, and he washed the 2 glasses that were on the counter, and then he stood in the kitchen for a long time, doing nothing. Underneath the loss, underneath the ache of it, there was something that frightened him more than the sadness. There was relief, small, quiet, and unmistakable. The second thing was his brother Kevin calling to ask for money. Not for the first time. Marcus had lent Kevin money on 4 previous occasions, with the full understanding, on both sides, that it would not be returned. He had never once said no. But this time, standing in his living room with the phone to his ear, Marcus heard himself say, quietly and clearly, "I can't do that right now, Kevin." There was a long pause. Kevin said a few sharp words and ended the call. Marcus stood there holding his phone, heart pounding as though he had done something dangerous. He had not done anything dangerous, he had simply said no. But it was the first time in his life he could remember doing it, and his body did not yet know the difference between a boundary and a threat. The third thing was a cardboard box. He was reorganizing the spare room one Saturday afternoon, when he opened a box he had packed years earlier, without looking through it. Inside were notebooks. His notebooks, from when he was 19 and 20 years old. He sat down on the floor and read them for 2 hours. There were short stories. There were observations about people he had seen on buses and in coffee shops. There were plans, specific, detailed, earnest plans, for things he had wanted to do with his life. Places he had wanted to go, work he had wanted to create. A version of himself he had been building toward, carefully and hopefully, before something had gradually convinced him to stop. He sat with the last notebook in his hands for a long time after he finished. Then he said, out loud, to the empty room, "That was me." Not past tense as in gone. Past tense as in buried, and something in him decided, in that quiet moment on the floor of an unpacked room, that buried was not the same as dead. He began therapy in March of 2022. His therapist was a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had a direct way of speaking and an even more direct way of listening. She did not let him stay in his head. When he tried to explain his childhood analytically, she would ask him how it had felt. When he described his relationship patterns in general terms, she would bring him back to specific moments. It was uncomfortable work. It was also the most honest he had been with another person in years. Over the following months, he began to understand the shape of what had happened to him, not as a wound to display, but as a pattern to recognize. He had been taught, very early and very thoroughly, that his role was to absorb and accommodate, that wanting things was a burden he placed on others, that saying no was a form of aggression, that making himself visible was somehow impolite. None of those things were true, but they had been true enough, for long enough, that they had become the operating instructions of his life. He started writing again. At first it was just in his journal, rough and unpolished, words he had been holding for years, coming out in no particular order. Then it became more deliberate. He started a blog, published under a name that was not quite his own, where he wrote about growing up as the quiet one, the last one, the one who waited. He wrote about what it had cost him. He wrote about learning to say no. He wrote about sitting in parking lots and reading old notebooks, and feeling, at 34, like someone who was only beginning to introduce himself to himself. People found it, not millions of people, but enough people, the right people, leaving comments at 2 in the morning saying things like, "I thought I was the only one," and I didn't have words for this before I read yours. He started running. Slowly, badly, with no particular technique. He ran a 5K in October of 2022 and finished near the back of the group. He did not care. He stood at the finish line breathing hard, with his hands on his knees, and he felt genuinely proud of himself for the first time in longer than he could remember. It was not a complicated feeling. It was not grand. It just felt like his. He set boundaries with his family, not with speeches or confrontations, just with consistent, quiet decisions. He stopped sending money he could not afford to send. He stopped rearranging his life to fix problems that were not his to fix. Some of his siblings responded with confusion. Kevin did not call for 3 months. His mother said very little, but she stopped asking in the same way she used to ask, and Marcus understood that as a kind of adjustment, slow and imperfect and real. His father remained at the edge of his life by a mutual silence that neither of them had formally agreed to, but both of them maintained. Marcus did not carry anger about Gerald anymore. He carried understanding, which was heavier in some ways and lighter in others. In 2023, Marcus was promoted at work. His supervisor told him, with genuine warmth, that she had always seen his capability, but had assumed he was content where he was. Marcus thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about how many years he had spent making himself look content so that no one would have to accommodate his ambitions. He thought about how good he had become at that performance and how much it had cost him. By late 2024, his life was not transformed in the way that dramatic stories promise transformation. He was not wealthy. He was not famous. He had not written a published book or built a business or moved to a new city and reinvented himself from the outside in. He still lived in the same apartment, though the spare room now had the desk cleared and the treadmill fixed and the boxes finally unpacked. He still worked at the same company, though in a different position, with a different sense of what he was doing there. He still carried the patterns of his childhood, though he could see them now, which meant he could choose, more often than before, not to follow them. He mentored 2 younger men at a church he had chosen himself, a small, plain-spoken congregation where people asked questions and sat with the difficulty of them rather than pretending everything had easy answers. He spoke openly, in those conversations, about what it had looked like to live small, about what it had cost, about the difference between humility and disappearance. His blog had a modest following. He wrote when he had something real to say, which was more often than it used to be. He still ran, still poorly, still without caring. He called his mother every Sunday. He was honest with her in ways that would have been impossible 5 years earlier, and she, in her slow and imperfect way, was honest with him too. On a Sunday morning in November, Marcus sat at the desk in his spare room, his writing room he had started calling it, with a notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. The apartment was quiet. No one was waiting for him to be something specific. No one was watching. He picked up his pen and began to write. Not for the blog, not for anyone else. Just because there was something in him that needed to be said, and he was, finally and simply, the person who was going to say it. Outside, the city was waking up. He could hear it distantly through the window. Cars, voices, the ordinary sounds of the world continuing. He did not need to be part of any of it in that moment. He had his desk, and his notebook, and the quiet, and the small but unshakable knowledge that the ground beneath him belonged to him now. It had taken him a long time to find it. He had no intention of giving it up again. End of story.